Hi all, welcome back. This section of lecture, we're going to talk about spinal cord. Last time out, we talked about the brain and the different regions of the brain that makes up a major portion of the central nervous system. The other portion of the central nervous system is the spinal cord. And so we're going to spend some time talking about different regions of the spinal cord and kind of how the spinal cord works, how reflex arcs work, and whatnot. So let's jump into it. So first, of course, this is a long column of nervous tissue that's running down the vertebral canal. We'll look at different regions. This gets at kind of the spine regions where we've talked about before, the lumbar region, the thoracic region, etc. So there are roughly 31 segments that make up the spinal nerves. And of course, they're grouped just like when we were talking about the brain, they're grouped with the vertebrae and which they're associated with. So when we're talking about the brain, we talked about the frontal, the parietal, okay, etc. And the names of the brain, the name of the regions of the brain are related to the bones they're associated with. Same thing when we talk about the spinal nerves, they're named after the regions of the vertebrae that they're associated with. Okay, so let's look at a longitudinal section, okay, and kind of look at the different regions of the brain. So you have the cervical enlargement. Okay, that supplies the nerves to the upper limbs, and then the lumbar enlargement supplies nerves to the lower limbs. And then you have some other regions where you have some tapering off. You have some connective tissue that anchors the spinal cord to the coccyx, which is the film terminella. And the cauda equina is a series of nerves that kind of extend down into the vertebral canal. So if we're looking at this, okay, so the cervical enlargement, again, that's supplying the nerves to the upper portions of the body, the upper limbs. Okay, so the peripheral nervous system would connect into this cervical enlargement. Okay, so it's larger there because there's more nerve bodies there. There's more kind of nervous tissue, and there's more connective points. Okay, doesn't mean that all these signals have to be sent up into the brain. We'll look at how that works here in a little bit, but then there will be axons that are moving down and back up to the different regions. So they may move down into the lumbar enlargement if there's a connection that's needed between kind of the upper limb movement and the lower limb movement, like if you're walking and swinging your arms, okay, those two things are connected, so you get nerve impulses from both regions occurring at relatively the same time. Okay, you get that tapering region below the lumbar is called the conus medullaris, okay, and that's really kind of the end of the lumbar enlargement. Okay, the cauda equina are axons, nerve fibers that are being sent down into kind of the coccyx region, down into the last portions of the spine. The film terminale is connective tissue that holds the spinal cord in place to the coccyx, basically. So as the spine rotates and moves, the spinal cord is held in place. It's anchored to the coccyx. Okay. We'll come back and talk about spinal injuries and how that works later in lectures to come. All right, so when we look at a cross section of the spinal cord, now we're looking at, well, what is it made up of? What's the molecular or the cellular makeup of a spinal cord when we do a cross section? Okay. So it's sort of the opposite of what we see when you look at a cross section of the brain. So remember, the brain, the outer surface is gray matter and the inner surface is white matter. So the inner surface on the brain is where you're going to find all your axons that are myelated, okay, and the outer surface is where you're going to find all your cell bodies, your somas, and dendrites. Well, the opposite is true for the spinal cord. The inside of the spinal cord is where you're going to find all the gray matter, the dendrites, okay, the cell bodies, and then the axons are going to be on the outside. The gray matter is arranged in what we call horns. Okay, the white matter is arranged in the funicula. And there's different regions of horns. We'll talk about it, kind of what region serves what purpose here in a second. Okay, again, there's also some specialty structures outside of the spinal cord. So away from the spinal cord, we have posterior root ganglion, and this outside of the spinal cord where you can also find cell bodies. Okay, and so this really plays an important role when we talk about reflex arcs, because now you can get some control that doesn't need to be sent to the brain, that can just be controlled within that region. And we'll talk about different ways that works. The anterior root contains motor neurons, and we'll look at that here in a second also. And the posterior root is for sensory. So the posterior horn of the gray matter is for sensory. The anterior horn is for motor neurons. And so if you have, let's say, you slice your finger, then you will get pain receptors, sensory receptors go to the posterior horn, okay, and then the motor of moving that finger, flexing that finger, okay, those actions would come from the anterior horn. So the connection between the two horns. So one is for sensory, the other is for motor function. Okay, some cases that sensory information is coming from the brain, so it would come in, the pain receptors would be sent into the posterior horn, that information will be sent up to the brain. Okay, the brain would interpret that information and send impulses back, either to control glands, muscles, maybe it's controlling blood vessels from dilation or contraction of the blood vessels, whatever it might be. And then if there's some motor function that needs to happen, it would be passed to the anterior horn and sent to the muscles. And we'll look at examples of this as we progress. Okay, so you have two main spinal cord functions. The first is spinal reflexes. Okay, so these are motor functions that don't really need to go to the brain. So the impulse is not sent to the brain. This is controlling things in that region, okay, without a signal going to the brain. And then conductive pathways. Okay, so this would be a impulse that is sent to the brain, and then a impulse that is sent back from the brain. Okay, so it's basically a highway of action potentials, going one way, coming back from the brain, etc. Okay, so let's talk about the reflexes first. So the reflexes, again, these are not sent to the brain. Okay, so this is a stimulus that stays within the region. Okay, and this can be controlling all kinds of things. It can control heart rate, blood pressure, your ability to swallow, cough. Um, so these are automatic subconscious responses. Okay, and so sometimes the the stimulus is outside of the body. Okay, like sticking your hand on a hot surface and then retracting your arm real quick. Okay, that's a sensory, that's an automatic sensory or reflex sensory that came, the sensory came from outside the body. Okay, within the body might be, a little bit of food that's stuck near the epiglottis. Okay, so near the region where your esophagus and trachea kind of connect. You can get a little bit of food stuck in that region, so you need to cough to try to clear that. Okay, that's a within the body stimuli. Okay, and we'll look at some examples of this. So the reflex arc just means that we're tracking the pathway of the neural impulse. Okay, so how does it go? It's going from the sensory receptor to neurons to an effector. So it's coming back. Okay, a simple one. Normally, when we talk about simple reflexes, means there's less connective points. Okay, maybe just one sensory and one motor neuron. Okay, complex arcs could involve multiple sensory neurons, okay, multiple interneurons, multiple motor neurons, and we'll look at some examples of how this works right now. Okay. All right, so let's say that we are talking about you sticking something warm, or for that matter hot, close to the skin. Okay, so you stick your hand, the back of your hand maybe, or something like that, close to a flame, a candle. Okay, the receptors there, the thermal receptors there are going to signal that. Okay, the temperature change, we'll get to thermal receptors, but you have protein gates and thermal receptors that are sensitive to temperature. Okay, and when that temperature is reached, that gate opens. And when that gate opens, then it allows for an impulse to occur, and those receptors will send the signal from the receptor to the sensory neuron, or it is part of the sensory neuron, to a cell body, which is in those ganglia that occur off of the spinal cord. That cell body in the ganglia will the chemistry in that cell body will change. That action potential will be sent away from the ganglia to the posterior horn. Okay, that's where the sensory is coming in at. Okay, that will synapse, and it'll send from the posterior to the anterior horn. Now we're into the motor control. Okay, and that signal will be sent. That action potential will continue to the muscle that's controlling this region. Okay, and that muscle might contract, okay, and pull your hand away from the flame. Okay, and so remember we talked about this. Okay, when that action potential is carried, okay, you're gonna have acetylcholine being released. The motor plate is then going to allow sodium to travel in. Okay, and now you're going to get that sodium changing the chemistry of the muscle cells. The calcium's going to be leaving from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, interacting with the troponin, and now you got actin myosin connection and contraction of the muscle, and your hands moved away from the flame. That's a reflex arc. Okay, we'll practice them in lab if you haven't watched this prior to lab, but we'll practice some reflex arcs in lab. Okay, so reflex behavior can happen a couple different ways. You can have monosynaptic or stretch reflexes. Okay, so this we'll practice in lab, and you probably have, most people have probably experienced this. This is a patellar reflex, which doctors use often to make sure that, again, at least that region of your body is working the way it should. You should have a patellar reflex, or what some people call the knee jerk reflex. That's when the patellar tendon is tapped. Okay, it should send a signal. There's sensory uh, neurons there that show a stretch. It sends a signal to the muscle to contract, and then you get the posture change, or the foot moving. Okay, and we'll look at an example of this. Withdrawal reflex, I kind of just talked about that. This is normally associated with something that's painful. Okay, so if you step on a tack, you stick your hand to a stove. Okay, tissue damage, minor tissue damage, okay, will result in kind of this painful stimuli to prevent major tissue damage. Okay, and so the idea is you have a withdrawal reflex. You want to limit the damage to minor damage, and so this reflex happens very quickly. Okay, you get a stimulus back very quickly to move that object, move that hand, move that arm, move that foot, whatever it might be. And again, we'll cover these here in a second. Okay, so let's look at the patellar. Okay, so you have the patellar tendon or ligament, sorry, and when you hit that ligament, so that will send a receptor to associate that there's stretch going on. Okay, so that stretch sensory will then send the signal to the cell body that occurs in the ganglia. That goes to the posterior horn, then to the anterior horn. Okay, sends it back, and you get the contraction of that muscle. Okay, and that muscle will then force the leg out. Okay, the patellar ligament is probably the easiest one to have this happen, but that's not it's not the only one. Okay, so there are many muscles that will have these stretch receptors that occur in the muscle that you can get a similar response. You can get a similar kind of reflex response due to stretch. Okay, and this really just controls the individual's, the purpose of this is really to control the individual's kind of posture, movement. Okay, so a signal doesn't have to be sent to the brain when you need to just adjust a little bit, contract a little bit to keep you from falling down, to keep your balance. And so this is working, excuse me, this is working when you're on uneven surfaces and you're walking. Okay, the patella is stretching and it's sending signals back, and then a new signal is sent to that muscle. Contract a little more, relax a little more, this kind of thing. So it adjusts with movement of the body without having to send that signal up to the brain. Yeah. Okay, look at a withdrawal reflex. Similar kind of concept, but now you might have two different regions of the body. Okay, so you have attack, okay, or whatever it might be. It doesn't really matter. It's a receptor that's on the close to the outer edge of the skin. Okay, in this case, a pain receptor is going to send the signal. Okay, that's going to go to the posterior horn. Okay, again, first the ganglia, then the posterior horn. Okay, this is happening in a different region of the body. Okay, so that signal then has to make it from that posterior horn to the posterior horn. Okay, so this is going up the spinal cord in this case to the posterior horn in the different region, in this case the L5 region. Okay, and then that signal would be sent to the anterior horn, okay, and stimulate the muscles in that region to contract, which will cause the foot to rise and less pain, less of an issue. Okay, so you have a withdrawal. Okay, now most of the time, what's going on with systems, especially in the leg region, is at the same time this is occurring, you have another reflex that's occurring on the other limb. Okay, so if you're lifting this limb to avoid this pain, the other limb needs to have a response so you don't fall over. Okay, and so if we look at a crossed extensor reflex, okay, so this will often happen when related to balance. Okay, so if you're doing something like a withdrawal reflex or flexor, you got the other side of the body will need to contract or extend to basically control posture and things like that. Okay, so same time, you're shifting the body weight so the person will remain upright. So let's look at how that works. So same thing, gonna step on attack, sends a signal, moves up, sends it to the L5 region. Okay, that sends the signal to contract these muscles here. Okay, at the exact same time, though, a signal is sent across the horn to the other side of the body. Okay, for the other leg to flex, and at the same time, another region of the body, which would control the other muscles within the thigh in this case. Okay, so it's not just the thigh muscles. This could be working in the calf. I mean, like any region really. But the idea is that you have multiple reflexes occurring at the same time. You have reflexes that are contracting due to pain, and then you have reflexes that are contracting and flexing due to weight shift. And so you have that motor neuron that would move up the spinal cord is not only stimulating the L5, but it's also stimulating, in this case, the L2 region. Okay, and so now you're getting stimulation of contraction of the thigh muscle. Okay, and the quadriceps are are relaxing. Okay, and you get the ability to lift the leg and control the weight of the body by standing on one leg. Okay, so you get stimulation and inhibition kind of at the same time. Okay. Now, how does this work in regards to the brain? Okay, so not all of the spinal cord reflexes are, or all of the actions are reflex arcs. And so a small portion are reflex arcs. Majority of the signals are being sent to the brain. Okay, so you can have sensory impulses that are related to pain or temperature, or other abrasions and discomfort and things like that will be sent maybe from the skin to the spinal cord. That signal will be sent to the brain. Okay, it's processed in the brain, and then you have a signal that's sent back to that region, right? To maybe a motor neuron to move it, or to a muscle via a motor neuron to move the muscle. Maybe it's to a gland to increase sweat production. There's all kinds of ways at which you can get a reaction. Okay? So if it's moving to the brain, we call that an ascending track. If it's moving from the brain, we call that the descending tracks. Okay, and again, ascending tracks are going to the brain, descending tracks are coming from the brain, and normally they're going to muscles or glands. Okay, these are just axons. Okay, so that are moving through the spinal cord, and they're moving up the spinal cord to different regions. So they will, if it's related to kind of motor function and things like that, they might be processed in the medulla oblongata. Okay, if it needs hormone association, or is going to be controlled a little bit by hormones, maybe it stops in the diencephalon. Okay, if we need memory of this, or we need to make an intelligent response, it might go all the way to the cerebrum. Okay, so it just depends on what needs controlled and what's the what kind of sensory you're getting. Okay, so major ascending. Right. There are three major ascending tracks. We'll look at kind of the role that each one plays. Not going to spend a huge amount of time on this, but the spinal phlegmatic track is for pain, and so we'll cover these here in a second. And then you got major descending. Now, of course, there's minors to all this, and there's lots and lots of different tracks, but the majors are going to be related to most things, and whatnot. So major descending, okay, so you have three major descendings. So three major ascending, three major descending, okay, and we'll look at kind of the role. What do they control next? Okay, so those major ascending tracks, okay, the posterior funiculi, okay, that is going to control body movement from skin, muscle, tendons, and joints. Okay, so this is related to touch. Okay, the spinal phlegmatic, again, I said this is related to pain. Okay, so this is changes in temperature, pressure, touch, but the result of discomfort. Okay, and so these two might have the same responses, one related to just the sensory that's not discomfort, and one that is related to discomfort. So normally stimulated by pain neurons, or temperature that's extremes, cold, hot, pressure that's extreme, too much pressure, not enough pressure, these kind of things. Okay, and then the spinal cerebellar tracts. Okay, these are going to be associated with coordination. Okay, so muscle movement, especially in the lower limbs and the trunk. Okay, so this is your ability to stand on one foot, your ability to jump. Okay, those kind of things, and keep balance. So really important for that. Descending, okay, again associated similar as the ascending, but a little bit different. Okay, so descending, the corticospinal tracts are voluntary movement of skeletal muscle. Okay. The reticulospinal tracts, okay, these are associated with glands typically, and maintaining tone. Okay, and then the cerebrospinal tracts are coordinations from the brain. Okay, so impulses for coordination of the brain. So you have voluntary movement, just kind of walking, movement of the arms, okay, everyday movement, keeping the core muscles working together. You have impulses associated with tone of the muscle, okay, but also glandular association, and then the coordination of muscles from both regions of the body, so like left leg, right leg, that kind of stuff, are all associated with that. So descending tracts, okay, normally have to do with kind of coordination of the muscle, like what muscle is going to be excited, what muscle is going to contract, versus the ascending track is how we're going to react to this. Are we going to react to this by moving muscles, or are we going to react to this by changing glandular output? Like what's the reaction going to be? Okay, so remember that ascending tracks are from sensory neurons to the brain. The brain's then going to coordinate some kind of response. That response will be sent via descending tracks to control that motor impulse. All right, and let's end it kind of talking about one situation that is yeah, it's a kind of it's a sad and very severe disease, ALS, or amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. Remember, sclerosis is scarring. We talked about multiple sclerosis, where you get scarring around the neurons, and amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or sometimes called Lou Gehrig's disease. Lou Gehrig was a baseball player for the New York Yankees. He was an excellent baseball player, very good at baseball, but he developed Lou Gehrig's disease in his mid 30s, I think 35 or so, somewhere in that. And he died within 2 years of developing it, as most people do. Die after you get ALS, you die relatively fast. We don't really know the cause. We know the possible cause, and we know kind of what's going on in the brain, but we don't know why it happens necessarily. It's not purely genetic either. So this isn't a very interesting disease, and we just need to spend a lot more time studying it. We don't know enough about it, but in some cases, we believe that you get overactive microglia, pardon me, that start to kill the neurons. Okay, and after you start getting some neurons being destroyed by these microglia, remember the microglia, their job is to clean up. And so if there's debris or if there's dead material, they clean it up. Well, in this case, they seem to start attacking the neurons. And once you start doing that, you start building up more and more radicals. And then that just causes more and more microglia to start destroying things. And your counterbalances, like your astrocytes, they don't have the capability of doing anything. And because, especially in the central nervous system and the spinal cord, there's no real regeneration of neurons and no capability of regenerating them. If it was only happening in the peripheral nervous system, it's possible that you could have some connections and regeneration going on. But in this case, there's really no regeneration, and the spinal cord and brainstem starts to degenerate and die. Early symptoms would be difficulties in speech, inability to move obviously regions of the body, clumsy, fatigue. So the coordination, the cerebellum and the medulla oblongata is starting to fail, and the coordination of muscles aren't working. And then with that, normally why individuals die relatively quickly after being diagnosed with ALS is this controls your ability to breathe. And so respiratory problems happen fairly quickly, and the individual can't breathe. So only about 10% are inherited. So clearly this is not just a genetic disorder, or if it is, we don't know enough about the DNA control of the system to say that it's a genetic disorder or disease in this case. Yeah, but it's fatal, 2 to 5 years with ALS. And right now there is no cure. Yeah, there's some medicine that might extend the life of the individual out towards more that 5-year mark. Lou Gehrig died, I think at 37. I think he was diagnosed 35 and died at 37, so about that 2-year mark. And so that was a long time ago. And they, I think, don't quote me on it. I think the 1940s might have been before that. So it's been a very long time, and we still, 80 plus years, and we still, yeah, we're just not extending people's lives very much with ALS. It's a very difficult disease to get a handle on, and we need a lot more research to do so. All right, next time out, we'll talk just peripheral nervous system to end this section.